My daughter-in-law's hand landed on my shoulder before I'd even pulled the chair halfway out. "This seat is for my mom. Get up." She didn't whisper it. She said it the way you'd tell a dog to move off the couch, flat, certain, already looking past me to wave her mother over. 12 people at that table turned to watch. My own son turned to watch. And nobody said a word. I want you to understand something before I tell you what happened next. That chair wasn't just a chair. It was the one closest to the kitchen doorway, the one I'd sat in every Christmas for 31 years, because it let me get up quietly to check the ham without disturbing anyone's conversation. It was, in every way that mattered, my seat at my own table in my own dining room, in the house my husband Walter and I bought the year our son Ryan was born. My name is Diane Whitfield. I'm 68 years old. And that night, standing in my own doorway in an apron dusted with flour, I was told to get up by a woman who had been part of this family for 6 years and had never once, not once, offered to help me carry a dish to the table. Let me back up. I'd been awake since 5 that morning. Not because anyone asked me to be, because I wanted it to be perfect. Ryan was bringing his wife Courtney's parents this year for the first time, and I decided, in the quiet, stubborn way widows sometimes decide things, that I would make it a Christmas nobody forgot. I brined the turkey myself, the way Walter's mother taught me, elbow deep in salt water at dawn with the radio, playing carols low so I wouldn't wake the house. I polished the china that had been my grandmother's, the pattern with the thin gold rim that only comes out twice a year. I ironed the tablecloth. I hand-wrote place cards in the good calligraphy pen, one for every guest, and set them exactly where I wanted people to sit. My late husband's empty chair at the head, left there on purpose, the way I do every year, with his reading glasses folded beside the plate. By 4 in the afternoon, my back ached, and my hands smelled like rosemary, and I didn't care, because the house looked the way it used to look when Walter was alive, and the kids were small, and Christmas still felt like something you built instead of something you survived. Courtney's parents arrived at 6. Her mother, Linda, came in wearing a red coat and an expression that suggested she was assessing the resale value of my curtains. Courtney kissed her on both cheeks like they hadn't seen each other in years, though I later learned they'd had lunch that Tuesday. I welcomed Linda warmly. I always try to. I poured her a glass of the good wine, the one I'd been saving, and told her how glad I was she could join us. She smiled at me the way you smile at a waitress whose name you didn't catch. Dinner was announced at 7:30. I'd spent 40 minutes arranging that table, the place cards in careful cursive, the candles at the right height so they wouldn't block anyone's face, my chair positioned where it had always been, beside the kitchen door, so I could slip in and out with the gravy boat without anyone having to move. I was still holding a serving spoon when I walked toward that chair. And that's when Courtney's hand came down on my shoulder, firm enough that I felt it in my collarbone the next morning. "This seat is for my mom. Get up." I looked at Ryan, my son, the boy I'd rocked through croup at 3 in the morning, whose Little League games I never missed even the year I had pneumonia, who used to leave me notes under my pillow that said, "Best mom in the world. Don't tell Dad I said so." He was 34 years old now, sitting 6 feet away with a beer in his hand, and he looked at his plate. Not at me, at his plate. "Courtney," I said, keeping my voice even, the way I'd learned to over 68 years of not giving people the satisfaction. "That's actually where I always—" "It's fine, Diane." She was already pulling the chair further out for her mother, who was settling into it with the unhurried comfort of a woman who'd been told this was hers. "You can sit anywhere. There's room at the end." There was not, in fact, room at the end. There was a folding chair someone had wedged in near the hallway, half in the dining room and half out of it. No place setting, no candlelight reaching it, nothing but the cold draft from the front door every time it opened. I stood there for a moment with the serving spoon still in my hand, in the dress I'd pressed that morning, in the house I'd scrubbed top to bottom, at the table I'd set since before the sun came up. 12 faces waited to see what I'd do. My son studied his beer bottle like it held the answers to every question he didn't want to ask out loud. I set the spoon down gently beside the gravy boat. I untied my apron, folded it once, and laid it over the back of the folding chair I hadn't been given permission to sit in. Then I walked to the coat closet, took out my coat, and reached for my car keys off the hook by the door, the hook Walter had installed himself 31 years ago in a house that still, according to the deed sitting in my fireproof lockbox upstairs, had my name on it and nobody else's. I was almost to the door when my elderly neighbor Frank Doyle, who'd let himself in through the side entrance to drop off a plate of his wife's cookies like he did every year, caught my arm gently. "Diane," he said quietly, glancing past me at the table, at Courtney's mother settling into my chair like she owned it. "Before you go, you might want to wait. I saw a car pull up outside. Looked like your lawyer's." I didn't move toward the door. I turned around instead, coat still half-buttoned, and looked at Frank Doyle standing there with his wife's cookie tin still tucked under one arm like he hadn't meant to walk into the middle of something. "My lawyer," I repeated.
"Silversedan."
Pulled right up behind Ryan's truck. Frank glanced past me into the dining room, where nobody had noticed I was gone yet, where Linda was already unfolding her napkin in my chair like she'd done it 100 times before. "Figured you'd want to know before you left. I hadn't called my attorney, Harold Denning, in weeks. Not since I'd sat in his office in October, 6 weeks after Walter's first heart attack scare had put the fear of God into both of us, and asked him to help me get my affairs in order the way you do when you're 68 and you've buried a husband and you don't trust anyone to look out for you the way you looked out for yourself. Harold had a habit of dropping by unannounced around the holidays. Ever since his own wife passed, said it was easier than being alone in his office with a bottle of scotch, and I never minded, because Harold Denning had been drawing up my family's paperwork since Ryan was in diapers. I didn't know why he'd choose tonight, but standing in that hallway with my coat half on, I found I wasn't in any hurry to leave and find out from a distance. I hung the coat back on Walter's hook. By the time I walked back into the dining room, Harold was already at the front door, stamping snow off his shoes, wearing his Goodwill coat, and carrying the leather folder he always brought when something needed to be official. Ryan looked up first, confused. Courtney's smile faltered for exactly 1 second before she recovered it, because women like Courtney recover quickly. It's practically a professional skill. "Diane." Harold nodded to me, warm as ever, then let his eyes travel around the table, the china, the candles, the place cards in my handwriting, and finally, the empty folding chair by the hallway with my folded apron laid over the back of it. He didn't say anything about it. He didn't need to. Harold Denning had known me long enough to read a room the way other men read a contract. "Mrs. Whitfield, sorry to intrude on Christmas dinner. This won't take long." He said it to the whole table, pleasant, unbothered, the way he probably delivered bad news to grown men in boardrooms for 40 years. "I was hoping to catch you and Ryan together, actually. Saves me a second trip." Ryan set his beer down. "Is everything okay?" "Everything's fine. Better than fine, actually." Harold pulled out the chair beside Walter's empty place setting, not my folding chair, not anywhere near it, but a real chair, at the real table, and sat down like he'd been invited, because in every way that mattered, he had been. "I just finalized some paperwork on your mother's estate planning this week, and given that most of the family's here, I thought it'd save everyone a headache if I explained it in person rather than mailing letters that get lost behind the holidays." Courtney's mother, Linda, had gone very still in my chair. I noticed that. I noticed the way her fork paused halfway to her mouth. "Most of you know Diane owns this house outright," Harold continued, opening the leather folder. "Has for 31 years, ever since she and Walter paid it off. What you might not know is that back in October, Diane came to see me about updating her will and her power of attorney." He glanced at me, a question in his eyebrows, silently asking permission to keep going. I gave him the smallest nod. At the time, Harold said, she named Ryan as her sole beneficiary and her medical and financial power of attorney, effective immediately upon incapacity. Standard stuff for a woman her age, especially after Walter's passing. I drew it up. She signed it. We notarized it. Filed and done. Ryan was watching his mother's lawyer with the particular stillness of a man who senses a door closing somewhere in a house he thought he knew every room of. "But," Harold said, and here he closed the folder gently, resting his hand on top of it. "Given some conversations I've had with Diane more recently, and given what I just walked in on in this dining room tonight, I think it's worth mentioning that those documents aren't finalized. Nothing's been filed with the county yet. I was actually driving over tonight to get her final signature on the power of attorney paperwork. He looked directly at Courtney then, not unkindly, the way a man looks at someone when he already knows more than they think he does. Which is why, Harold said, I'd very much like to know who decided my client doesn't get to sit at her own table. Nobody answered him right away. That's the thing I remember most clearly, the silence, thick as the gravy going cold on the table, 12 people suddenly finding their napkins very interesting. It was Linda who finally spoke, still seated in my chair, her voice pitched with the kind of forced lightness people use when they're trying to make a problem smaller than it is. Oh, that was nothing, just a little mix-up with the seating. Diane doesn't mind, do you, Diane? I did not answer her. I looked at my son instead. Ryan, I said, and I kept my voice level, the way I'd kept it for 6 years of small comments and smaller apologies. Do you want to tell Harold what happened, or should I? Ryan's jaw worked. He looked at Courtney. He looked at his beer. And for one long, terrible moment, I thought he was going to do what he'd done for the last 6 years, nothing. Let it pass. Let his wife's comfort matter more than his mother's dignity, because that had become the quiet architecture of every holiday since Courtney decided the seating chart. The guest list, the very shape of Christmas belonged to her now. But then he set his beer down, and I watched something shift in his face. Not anger. Exactly. More like a man waking up in a room he'd been sleepwalking through. Courtney told my mother to get up from her seat, Ryan said quietly. Told her to sit in the folding chair by the door instead. So Linda could have it. Ryan. Courtney's voice cracked, sharp and fast. I'm talking, Court. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. 34 years of being my son came out in the set of his shoulders. My mother got up at 5 this morning to brine a turkey. She ironed a tablecloth that was my grandmother's. She handwrote place cards for people who've been in this family 6 years and people who walked in tonight for the first time. And you put her in a folding chair by the coat closet so your mother could sit at the table instead. Harold, to his credit, said nothing during this. He simply sat with his folder closed under his hand, watching, the way a good lawyer watches a deposition unfold exactly the way he suspected it would. It's Christmas, Courtney said, and now there was real panic under the composure, the particular panic of someone watching a story get told the way it actually happened instead of the way she'd planned to tell it later. I just wanted my mom to feel included. She doesn't have family nearby. I didn't think. You didn't think about my mother at all, Ryan said. That's the problem. You haven't for a while. Linda stood up so fast her chair scraped against the hardwood, the same hardwood I'd had refinished 2 summers ago, the same floor Walter and I danced on the night Ryan was born, pacing the length of it with him in my arms until dawn. I don't have to sit here and be insulted. Nobody's insulting you, Linda. I said, and I meant it, because I had nothing against the woman personally. She was a guest who'd been handed a stolen seat and settled into it without asking whose it was. That wasn't a crime. It just wasn't her table to accept. You're welcome at this table. You always would have been, if you'd simply been offered a chair instead of given mine. Harold cleared his throat gently. For what it's worth, he said, folding his hands on the leather folder. I've drawn up estate documents for a great many families over the years. I've learned you can tell almost everything about how a family will handle an inheritance by watching how they treat the person whose name is on the deed while she's still alive to see it. The room had gone very quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet now. Not the paralyzed silence from before. This was the silence of people doing arithmetic they didn't want to do out loud. I walked to the head of the table, to the empty chair where Walter's reading glasses sat folded beside an untouched plate, the way I said it every year. I picked up my apron from the back of the folding chair, and I did not sit in the folding chair, and I did not ask Linda to move. I simply stood there in my own dining room and said the thing I should have said the moment that hand landed on my shoulder. This is my house. It has been for 31 years, and nobody, not tonight, not ever again, tells me where I sit in it. Nobody moved for a long moment. Then Harold, ever the practical one, cleared his throat and opened his folder again, as if this were simply the next item on an agenda. Diane, he said, since we're all here, and since I drove out in the snow for this, would you like to sign that power of attorney tonight? Nothing changes with the will itself. I just need your signature to make it official, and it seemed silly to make you drive to my office next week. I looked at Ryan, really looked at him, the way I hadn't let myself in longer than I wanted to admit. He looked back at me, and for the first time in what felt like years, I saw the boy who used to leave notes under my pillow. Not because Christmas had fixed everything. It hadn't. 6 years of small erosions don't undo themselves over one dinner and one lawyer's visit. But I saw, in his face, that he understood something now he hadn't understood an hour ago. Yes, I said. I'd like to sign it. Harold slid the paper across the table, past the china, past the candles, and I signed my name the way I'd signed it for 68 years, steady, unhurried, in a house that had never once stopped being mine no matter who tried to rearrange the furniture inside it. Courtney hadn't said a word since Ryan's outburst. She sat very still, watching her mother, watching her husband, watching the shape of her marriage shift slightly in front of a table full of witnesses. I didn't relish it. I want to be clear about that because this was never about revenge. It was never about winning. It was about being seen in my own home, at my own table, after 31 years of setting it. Mom, Ryan said quietly, once Harold had tucked the signed papers back into his folder. Can we talk? After dinner? We can talk right now, I said, and I pulled out the chair at the head of the table. Walter's chair, the one I never sat in, the one I kept for him every year with his glasses folded beside the plate, and instead I pulled out the chair beside it. My chair, the one by the kitchen door. Linda had already quietly slid 2 seats down without being asked, murmuring something about not wanting to make a fuss, and Courtney had gone pale in a way that told me this conversation wasn't finished, just paused for company. I sat down. I picked up the serving spoon, and I served the turkey I'd brined at 5 that morning. In the dress I'd pressed, at the table I'd set with my own hands, in the house that had my name on the deed and always would. Mr. Doyle, I said, catching Frank's eye where he still stood awkwardly in the doorway with his cookie tin, clearly debating whether he'd wandered into a family matter he had no business seeing. Sit down. There's plenty of turkey, and you drove all the way over here in the cold just to bring us cookies. The least I can do is feed you. Frank smiled, relieved, and found a chair. Christmas dinner went on. Stilted. At first, the kind of quiet that follows a storm before conversation finds its footing again. But by the time I brought out the pie, Ryan was refilling my water glass without being asked, the way he used to when he was young enough to still think of it as his job. Courtney said very little. Linda said even less. I don't know exactly what happens next in this family. I don't know if Ryan and Courtney's marriage bends towards something healthier, or if this was simply the night a crack finally showed itself in daylight. I don't know if Linda will be back next Christmas, or if she'll be invited properly this time, with a chair of her own that nobody has to give up. What I know is this. I built this family with my own hands, the same hands that brined that turkey, that ironed that tablecloth, that signed that deed 31 years ago. And no one, not a daughter-in-law with a borrowed sense of entitlement, not anyone, gets to tell me where I sit in the home I built it in. I kept my seat. I kept my house. And for the first time in 6 years, at my own Christmas table, I finally felt like I'd kept my son, too.